The coffee cup shattered against the concrete floor of the Seattle warehouse as Chen dove behind a shipping container, her heart hammering against her ribs. The crack of gunfire echoed through the industrial space, and for one terrifying moment, muscle memory almost made her reach for a weapon that hadn't been at her side for 8 years. What happened in the next 45 minutes would shatter the quiet life she'd built as a civilian security consultant and force her to confront the ghost of the most precise killer the military had ever trained. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Chen had perfected the art of being unremarkable. At 32, she moved through the world like background noise, deliberately forgettable in her understated business attire and wire-rimmed glasses that she didn't actually need. Her shoulder-length black hair was always pulled into a conservative bun, and her small frame seemed to disappear into the crowd of tech workers and business professionals that populated downtown Seattle. For the past 8 years, she'd worked as a risk assessment consultant for corporate security firms, analyzing threats from behind a desk, surrounded by computer screens and statistical models that reduced human danger to manageable data points. Her colleagues at Meridian Security Solutions knew her as the quiet analyst who could predict criminal patterns with unsettling accuracy, the one who somehow always knew exactly where security vulnerabilities would manifest before they became problems. She arrived at the office each morning at 7:30 sharp, worked through lunch at her standing desk, and left promptly at 5:15, declining invitations to happy hours or company social events. Her supervisor, Janet Walsh, had long ago stopped trying to draw into the office social dynamic, accepting that some people preferred professional boundaries to workplace friendships. What none of them knew was that Maya's uncanny ability to predict violent scenarios came from intimate familiarity with the minds of people who specialized in causing maximum damage with minimum exposure. When she analyzed building security, she instinctively thought like someone planning an infiltration. When she reviewed personnel files for potential insider threats, she recognized the psychological markers because she'd once been evaluated for the same dangerous capabilities. Her recommendations were always precise, always effective, and always carried the weight of experience that her colleagues assumed came from advanced training in criminology or psychology. Maya had spent 8 years carefully constructing this mundane identity, learning to suppress the hyper-awareness that had once made her legendary among a very small, very classified community of military specialists. When she walked through the city, she forced herself not to automatically catalog escape routes, sniper positions, and tactical advantages. When she heard sudden loud noises, she trained herself not to drop into a combat crouch or scan for threats. With the methodical precision that had once been second nature, the reflexes were still there, buried under layers of deliberate civilian normalcy, but she'd become expert at ignoring them. Her apartment in Capitol Hill reflected the same commitment to ordinariness. Clean lines, neutral colors, furniture. From mainstream retailers that could have belonged to any young professional in the city. The only hint of her former life was hidden in a safety deposit box across town. Items she'd never been able to bring herself to destroy, but couldn't bear to keep close. Sometimes, late at night when the city noise faded and her mind wandered, she would remember the weight of precision instruments in her hands, the absolute stillness required for impossible shots, the satisfaction of protecting people who would never know her name. Then she would force herself to focus on quarterly security reports or risk assessment algorithms until the memories retreated. This particular Tuesday had started like any other. Maya was reviewing surveillance footage from a client's warehouse district, looking for patterns that might indicate organized theft operations. The footage was tedious, hours of loading dock activity and delivery truck rotations, but she'd learned to find meaning in seemingly random data. Her ability to spot anomalies had made her reputation in the security consulting world, though she'd never been able to explain that her pattern recognition came from years of studying human behavior through rifle scopes, learning to distinguish between innocent civilians and legitimate targets in situations where a single mistake could start international incidents. Her supervisor had assigned her to personally inspect the Bayview industrial complex after her analysis suggested unusual activity patterns that didn't match the client's reported operations. Maya had objected, preferring desk work to field assignments, but Janet had been insistent. The client was paying premium rates for comprehensive security assessment, and Maya's recommendations carried enough weight that her physical presence would add credibility to the final report. Against her better judgment, Maya had agreed to spend the afternoon touring the facility, interviewing security personnel, and conducting what should have been a routine on-site evaluation. The warehouse complex sat on Seattle's industrial waterfront, a maze of concrete buildings and shipping containers that processed imports from Asia before distributing them throughout the Pacific Northwest. Maya had reviewed the architectural plans and security protocols in advance, noting several vulnerabilities that would need addressing, but nothing that suggested immediate danger. The facility manager, Robert Torres, had seemed professional and cooperative during their phone conversations, eager to address any security concerns that might affect their insurance rates or regulatory compliance. Maya arrived at the complex at 2 p.m, carrying her standard field kit of measuring devices, cameras, and documentation tools that would support her security assessment. Torres met her at the main gate, a heavy-set man in his 50s, who moved with the slightly paranoid awareness of someone who'd worked industrial security for decades. He seemed genuinely concerned about the anomalies Maya had identified in the surveillance data, asking detailed questions about her methodology and timeline analysis that suggested he took security seriously. The tour began routinely enough. Torres walked her through the main warehouse spaces, explaining workflow patterns and shift rotations, while Maya took notes and photographs for her report. The facility was larger than she'd expected, with multiple buildings connected by covered walkways and service corridors that created a complex three-dimensional environment. Maya found herself automatically analyzing sightlines and cover positions, cataloging information her conscious mind insisted she didn't need, but her subconscious refused to ignore. It was in the third warehouse that Maya's carefully suppressed instincts began sending warning signals she couldn't quite rationalize. The space felt wrong in ways that had nothing to do with security protocols or operational efficiency. Workers moved with too much tension, glancing nervously at her and Torres as they passed. Shipping containers were arranged in patterns that created unnecessary blind spots and concealment opportunities. Most telling, the workers seemed to be avoiding certain sections of the warehouse entirely, creating foot traffic patterns that didn't match the facility's stated operational requirements. Torres's demeanor had also shifted subtly as they moved deeper into the complex. His explanations became less detailed, more evasive, and he seemed increasingly eager to move her along rather than allowing her to conduct the thorough inspection she'd outlined. When Maya asked to review specific areas that her analysis had flagged as problematic, Torres provided excuses about ongoing operations or safety concerns that didn't align with the activity she could observe. Maya's training, both official and unofficial, had taught her to trust her instincts even when she couldn't articulate the reasons for her unease. Something was fundamentally wrong at the Bayview Industrial Complex, and Torres was either complicit or unaware of activities that extended far beyond legitimate import operations. She began adjusting her documentation to capture evidence of the discrepancy she was observing, taking photographs from angles that would reveal the layout inconsistencies and operational anomalies that suggested the facility was being used for purposes not reflected in their licensing or insurance documentation. The confrontation began when Maya insisted on inspecting a section of the warehouse that Torres claimed was temporarily off-limits due to hazardous materials storage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her security training required her to verify safety protocols around dangerous substances, and she'd seen nothing in the facility documentation that indicated hazardous materials licensing. When she pressed the issue, Torres became visibly agitated, making phone calls in Spanish that carried an urgency that had nothing to do with scheduling conflicts or operational concerns. Maya realized she was in danger when she noticed that the workers who'd been moving normally throughout the warehouse had suddenly disappeared, leaving her alone with Torres in a space that offered multiple concealment positions for people who might be preparing to ensure her silence. Her civilian identity demanded that she leave immediately, file her report, and let law enforcement investigate any criminal activity she might have uncovered. But the part of her mind that had kept her alive in much more dangerous situations was already calculating distances, analyzing cover, and preparing for possibilities that Chen, the security consultant, wasn't supposed to be able to handle. Torres ended his phone call and turned to her with an expression that had shifted from nervous cooperation to cold assessment. Maya understood immediately that she'd stumbled into something that extended far beyond import violations or tax evasion, something serious enough that her knowledge represented a threat that couldn't be managed through legitimate channels. She also realized that her carefully maintained civilian identity was about to be tested in ways that would either prove her transformation was complete or reveal that she'd been hiding rather than truly changing. The first shot came from a position Maya had unconsciously cataloged 15 minutes earlier, a shipping container arrangement that provided elevated concealment for someone with a rifle. Torres dove for cover behind a forklift, shouting instructions in Spanish to people Maya couldn't see but whose position she could estimate based on the acoustic signatures of their movements. Maya's coffee cup shattered as she threw herself behind a concrete support pillar, her mind automatically shifting into analytical modes she'd spent 8 years trying to forget. 3 shooters, based on the spacing of muzzle flashes and the coordination of their covering fire. Professional positioning that indicated military or paramilitary training. Weapons discipline that suggested they were more interested in controlling her movement than immediately killing her, which meant they wanted her alive for questioning about what she'd discovered and who she might have told. Maya's civilian identity screamed at her to surrender, to comply with whatever demands they might make, to hope that cooperation would lead to survival. But the part of her that had once been known by a different name, the part that had earned a reputation for impossible shots under impossible conditions, was analyzing the tactical situation with cold precision. 3 known hostiles with small arms, probably assault rifles based on the sound signature. Unknown number of additional personnel in the facility. No immediate backup or extraction options. Limited ammunition among the hostiles based on their measured rate of fire. Multiple escape routes if she could neutralize the immediate threat. Maya pressed herself against the concrete pillar, feeling her heart rate slow and her breathing steady as autonomous systems she'd trained for years, activated despite her conscious efforts to suppress them. For 8 years, she'd been Chen, the quiet security consultant who analyzed threats from a safe distance. But the woman taking cover in a Seattle warehouse was someone else entirely. Someone whose skills were about to be tested against people who had no idea what they'd chosen to hunt. The transformation was subtle but complete. Her posture shifted from civilian panic to professional assessment. Her eyes began tracking movement patterns with the methodical precision of someone trained to observe and eliminate targets at distances measured in city blocks. Her hands moved automatically to check for weapons she didn't carry, muscle memory so deeply ingrained that conscious thought couldn't override the motion. Chen was about to discover that 8 years of hiding couldn't erase the most fundamental truths about who she really was. And the people hunting her in the warehouse were about to learn why some legends disappear, not because they've lost their edge, but because the world isn't ready for what they're capable of when properly motivated. The second burst of automatic fire chipped concrete from her cover position, forcing Maya to adjust her position while maintaining concealment. She could hear Torres coordinating with the shooters, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to directing violent operations. Maya realized that her security assessment had uncovered something significant enough to justify killing a civilian consultant, which meant law enforcement investigation was inevitable, regardless of whether she survived the immediate threat. Her phone was in her jacket pocket, but reaching for it would expose her to the crossfire that was keeping her pinned behind the concrete pillar. Even if she could call for help, police response time in the industrial district would be at least 12 minutes, and her tactical assessment suggested she had perhaps 3 minutes before the shooters would adjust their positions to eliminate her cover entirely. Maya closed her eyes for just a moment, feeling the weight of 8 years of careful civilian existence pressing against the tactical reality of her situation. She could maintain her cover identity and almost certainly die. Or she could embrace skills she'd spent nearly a decade trying to forget and probably survive to face questions she wasn't prepared to answer. The third burst of gunfire made the decision for her. Maya's eyes snapped open, and for the first time in 8 years, she allowed herself to think like the predator she'd once been trained to be. The quiet security consultant was about to give way to someone much more dangerous. Someone whose last official shot had ended a career and haunted her dreams ever since. Maya began moving with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd spent years learning to navigate hostile territory while remaining invisible to people specifically trained to find and kill her. Her route through the warehouse took advantage of concealment opportunities that civilian Maya wouldn't have recognized. Positions that provided cover while allowing her to gather intelligence about her attacker's capabilities and intentions. She reached the emergency exit she'd noted during her initial walkthrough, only to discover that it had been chained shut from the outside, confirming that this wasn't a spontaneous response to her investigation, but a planned operation designed to contain and eliminate threats to whatever activities the warehouse was concealing. Maya realized that Torres and his associates had been preparing for this possibility, which suggested that her analysis had identified something far more significant than simple import violations. The sound of coordinated movement indicated that the shooters were advancing, using professional fire and movement techniques to close the distance while maintaining overlapping fields of fire. Maya's tactical assessment shifted from escape to engagement, a transition that required her to embrace capabilities she'd sworn never to use again. Hidden behind a shipping container, Maya found herself remembering why she'd walked away from a military career that had promised unlimited advancement and access to the most classified operations in the defense community. The last time she'd pulled a trigger in the service of her country, the consequences had been so devastating that she'd resigned her commission and disappeared into civilian life rather than face the questions and investigations that would have followed. But the people hunting her through the Seattle warehouse hadn't given her the luxury of maintaining the peaceful existence she'd spent 8 years constructing. They'd forced her to choose between the quiet death of Maya Chen, the security consultant, and the resurrection of someone whose skills were legendary among a very small community of military specialists. Maya made her choice. She began moving through the warehouse with the deadly efficiency of someone who'd once been considered the most precise, long-range eliminator in the United States military, someone whose last shot had ended more than just an enemy operative's life. The question was whether the skills that had made her legendary were still sharp enough to keep her alive, and whether she could use them without losing herself completely to the identity she'd spent 8 years trying to escape. The hunt through the Bayview Industrial Complex was about to reveal whether Maya Chen could survive without becoming the person she'd sworn never to be again. And somewhere in the maze of shipping containers and concrete corridors, 3 professional killers were about to discover that they'd chosen to hunt someone whose reputation for precision had once been whispered about in the most classified briefing rooms in Washington. Maya's first improvised weapon came from the maintenance area near the loading dock, a steel pry bar that felt reassuringly solid in her hands, despite being a poor substitute for the precision instruments she'd once wielded with legendary accuracy. The weight was wrong, the balance unfamiliar, but the cold metal reminded her of winter mornings in Afghanistan, when her rifle had been the only thing standing between her unit and catastrophic intelligence failures. She moved through the warehouse, shadows with a fluidity that surprised her, muscle memory asserting itself despite 8 years of forced dormancy. Her breathing had settled into the controlled rhythm that had once allowed her to remain motionless for hours, waiting for targets to expose themselves at distances that pushed the absolute limits of ballistic physics. The hyper-awareness that had made her exceptional was flooding back, bringing with it sensory details that civilian Maya had trained herself to ignore. The first shooter's position betrayed itself through the reflection of his rifle scope on a warehouse window 30 meters away. Maya tracked the angle of the reflection to identify his exact location behind a stack of shipping containers, noting that his elevated position gave him excellent coverage of the central warehouse floor but created a blind spot that she could exploit if she approached from the maintenance corridor. Professional training was evident in his positioning, but Maya recognized the subtle tells that distinguished competent military contractors from elite special operations personnel. Torres was coordinating the search from a position near the Cohen warehouse office, his voice carrying clearly in the industrial space as he directed his team in rapid Spanish. Maya's linguistic training allowed her to understand that they were discussing extraction procedures and cleanup protocols, confirming that this operation had been planned well in advance of her arrival. They weren't just eliminating a security consultant who discovered their illegal activities. They were executing a contingency plan that suggested the Bayview Industrial Complex was a significant hub for operations that extended far beyond simple smuggling. The second shooter revealed himself when Maya deliberately triggered a motion sensor near the loading bay, causing him to adjust his position to cover what appeared to be an escape attempt. His movement was disciplined but predictable, following textbook urban warfare protocols that Maya had helped develop during her years training special operations personnel. She realized that her opponents were competent professionals, but they were operating according to conventional tactical doctrine against someone whose reputation had been built on unconventional solutions to impossible problems. Maya reached the maintenance area without being detected. Her approach route, taking advantage of blind spots she'd automatically cataloged during her initial tour of the facility. The tool storage contained items that could be weaponized, but more importantly, it provided access to the facility's utility systems. Maya's training had included infrastructure exploitation, the art of turning civilian environments into tactical advantages through creative use of electrical, plumbing, and ventilation systems. The warehouse's electrical panel was located behind the maintenance area, protected by a simple lock that Maya bypassed using techniques she'd learned for covert facility penetration. Her plan was elegant in its simplicity. By selectively cutting power to different sections of the warehouse, she could force her hunters to move through areas where their night vision equipment would be less effective while maintaining her own navigational advantages through intimate knowledge of the facility layout. Maya began systematically shutting down lighting circuits, starting with the sections furthest from her position and working inward to create the impression of cascading electrical failure rather than deliberate sabotage. The warehouse gradually descended into industrial twilight, broken only by emergency lighting and the filtered daylight coming through skylights 40 feet above the floor. Her opponents would adapt to the changing conditions, but the transition would create opportunities for someone who specialized in operating from concealment. The sound of frustrated Spanish voices confirmed that power outages were disrupting their coordination, forcing them to rely on radio communication that could be monitored and analyzed. Maya listened to their tactical adjustments, noting call signs and movement patterns that revealed more about their organization and capabilities than they realized. These weren't random criminals who'd hired muscle for warehouse security. They were part of a structured operation with military-style communication protocols and equipment that suggested significant financial backing. Maya's analysis was interrupted by the distinctive sound of someone attempting to breach the maintenance area lock. One of the shooters had recognized that the power outages were originating from the utility systems and was moving to investigate. Maya positioned herself behind a water heater, gripping the pry bar with hands that remembered the weight of precision instruments, designed for much more permanent solutions to tactical problems. The intruder entered the maintenance area with professional caution, rifle raised and night vision equipment scanning methodically for threats. Maya could see the infrared illuminator from his scope-painting laser, signatures on the walls as he cleared corners and potential hiding spots. His technique was flawless, following procedures that would have been effective against most civilian targets, or even moderately trained security personnel. Maya waited until he was committed to clearing the far corner of the maintenance area before moving. Her attack was swift and silent, the pry bar connecting with precision that reflected years of hand-to-hand combat training designed to incapacitate enemies without alerting nearby hostiles. The shooter dropped without firing a shot, his rifle clattering against concrete in a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the enclosed space. Maya immediately secured his weapon, a military-grade assault rifle with modifications that indicated serious financial investment in equipment acquisition. The weapon felt familiar in her hands despite being a different platform than she'd trained with extensively. More importantly, the scope and night vision attachment provided capabilities that would fundamentally alter the tactical balance of the engagement. She also recovered the shooter's radio, allowing her to monitor communications between Torres and the remaining gunmen. Their chatter revealed growing concern about their missing teammate and uncertainty about whether they were dealing with a civilian consultant who'd gotten lucky or someone with more dangerous capabilities. Maya realized that maintaining the illusion of amateur desperation would provide tactical advantages as long as her opponents continued underestimating her training and experience. The rifle scope revealed details about the warehouse interior that had been invisible to naked eye observation. Maya could now identify the exact positions of the remaining two shooters, noting that they'd adjusted their coverage to compensate for their missing teammate, but had created new vulnerabilities in their defensive pattern. More significantly, the thermal imaging attachment revealed additional personnel in the warehouse office area, suggesting that Torres had backup beyond the three shooters she'd initially identified. Maya's tactical assessment shifted as she realized the true scope of the threat. At least 6 hostiles total, possibly more, with professional equipment and coordination that suggested this was a significant operation rather than simple warehouse security. Her improvised engagement had evolved into something approaching a small unit combat operation, the kind of scenario she'd trained for extensively, but had hoped never to face outside of military service. The weight of the rifle in her hands brought back memories she'd spent 8 years suppressing, recollections of mountainous terrain and impossible shots that had saved American lives while ending others. Maya remembered the absolute stillness required for precision work at extreme distances, the mathematical calculations that turned ballistic physics into lethal geometry, the satisfaction of protecting people who would never know her name or understand the risks she'd taken on their behalf. But she also remembered the shot that had ended her military career, the moment when political calculations had conflicted with tactical reality and forced her to choose between following orders and preventing a catastrophe that would have destabilized an entire region. The decision had been correct from every moral and strategic perspective, but the consequences had made her continued service impossible. Maya forced herself to focus on immediate tactical requirements rather than historical regrets. The remaining shooters were adjusting their search pattern, working systematically through the warehouse sections, while maintaining radio contact with Torres. Their discipline was impressive, but Maya recognized the subtle inefficiencies that distinguished competent contractors from elite special operations personnel. They were following established procedures rather than adapting creatively to unexpected circumstances. Her next move took advantage of the warehouse's vertical space, using service ladders to reach the catwalk system that provided access to overhead lighting and ventilation equipment. The elevated position offered observation advantages that would allow her to track hostile movement, while remaining concealed from ground-level searches. More importantly, the catwalks provided firing positions that would enable precision engagement if the situation deteriorated beyond containment possibilities. Maya moved through the overhead maze with practiced silence, her route planned to avoid sections where her movement might trigger motion sensors or create sound signatures that would reveal her position. The rifle sling was adjusted for rapid deployment, muscle memory ensuring that the weapon would be immediately accessible if engagement became necessary. Her breathing remained controlled, heart rate steady, autonomous systems responding as they'd been trained despite years of civilian existence. From her elevated position, Maya could observe the entire tactical situation with clarity that transformed her understanding of the threat. The warehouse complex was larger than she'd realized during her ground-level tour, with connecting corridors and storage areas that suggested the facility was being used as a distribution hub for operations that extended throughout the Pacific Northwest. Vehicle activity visible through skylights indicated that additional personnel were arriving, turning her simple escape problem into something approaching a siege scenario. Torres was coordinating from the warehouse office, surrounded by communication equipment and surveillance monitors that revealed the sophistication of their security apparatus. Maya realized that her initial assessment had been fundamentally wrong. This wasn't a criminal operation that had been exposed by her security analysis. This was a well-established intelligence hub that had identified her as a threat before she'd even arrived at the facility. The implications were staggering. Someone had recognized Maya Chen as more than a simple security consultant, which meant her carefully constructed civilian identity had been compromised by people with access to classified databases that should have been sealed permanently. Her background investigation had been thorough enough to identify inconsistencies that suggested hidden military experience, possibly even revealing enough details to connect her current identity with her previous service record. Maya's radio intercept revealed the most disturbing intelligence yet. Torres was discussing extraction timelines and cleanup procedures with someone who was clearly coordinating from a remote location, using operational terminology that suggested this facility was part of a larger network. They weren't just eliminating a security consultant who discovered their activities. They were implementing damage control for a compromise that threatened operations across multiple locations. The conversation also revealed that Maya's supervisor at Meridian Security Solutions had been asking questions about her background, requesting documentation that had prompted the investigation that led to her identification as a potential threat. Janet Walsh's routine security clearance verification had triggered alerts in systems that Maya had assumed would remain dormant as long as she maintained her civilian profile. Maya realized that her 8 years of hiding were ending not because she'd made mistakes, but because the intelligence community had developed new analytical capabilities that could identify hidden operatives through pattern recognition and data correlation techniques that hadn't existed when she'd disappeared from military service. Her careful construction of Maya Xing's identity had been sophisticated enough to fool conventional background checks, but it hadn't anticipated algorithmic analysis that could identify behavioral signatures associated with specific types of classified training. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly as additional personnel arrived at the facility, their radio chatter indicating that they were establishing a perimeter to prevent escape while additional teams searched the warehouse interior. Maya counted at least 12 hostiles now, with heavy weapons and coordination that suggested this was a major operational response rather than simple damage control. Maya's position on the catwalk system provided excellent observation but limited mobility, and she realized that remaining stationary would eventually lead to detection and elimination. Her tactical options were narrowing to scenarios that would require her to engage multiple targets with precision that hadn't been tested in 8 years of civilian existence. The quiet security consultant who'd spent the morning reviewing surveillance footage was about to discover whether her legendary skills had survived years of deliberate suppression. The first engagement opportunity presented itself when 2 shooters moved through the warehouse section directly below her position, their search pattern bringing them into range where Maya's elevated angle would provide clear shots while minimizing the risk of return fire. The rifle scope revealed details about their equipment and positioning that confirmed Maya's assessment of their capabilities while providing targeting information that her training had taught her to exploit. Maya's hands moved automatically through pre-engagement, procedures she'd performed thousands of times in training and dozens of times in actual combat operations. Range estimation, wind calculation, breathing control, trigger discipline, all the microscopic details that separated competent marksmen from legendary snipers. The muscle memory was intact despite years of disuse, autonomous systems responding with precision that surprised her. But as Maya settled into firing position, she hesitated. 8 years ago, she'd walked away from military service because pulling the trigger had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The shot that had ended her career had been tactically perfect and strategically necessary, but the political ramifications had made her continued service impossible. Taking another life, even in legitimate self-defense, would inevitably lead to investigations that would expose her carefully hidden identity and force her to confront questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Maya's hesitation lasted only seconds, but it was long enough for the tactical situation to shift. The 2 shooters below her position adjusted their search pattern, moving out of optimal firing range while their radio communications indicated that additional teams were converging on the warehouse section where motion sensors had detected unusual activity. Maya's window for precision engagement was closing rapidly, forcing her to choose between maintaining concealment and eliminating immediate threats. The decision was made for her when one of the arriving teams began using thermal imaging equipment that would inevitably detect her body heat signature, despite the concealment provided by the catwalk system. Maya realized that her tactical advantages were being systematically eliminated by opponents who were adapting more quickly than she'd anticipated to the threat posed by someone with her specific skill set. Maya began moving again, abandoning her elevated position in favor of mobility that would prevent the thermal imaging teams from establishing accurate targeting data. Her route through the warehouse took advantage of heat sources and reflective surfaces that would confuse thermal signatures while maintaining her access to observation positions that would allow her to monitor hostile movement patterns. The rifle felt heavier as she moved, weighted not just by its physical mass, but by the implications of carrying a weapon she'd sworn never to use again. Maya had spent 8 years convincing herself that her military skills were relics of a previous life that had no relevance to her civilian existence. But the tactical reality of her situation was forcing her to acknowledge that the most fundamental aspects of her training had never truly been suppressed, only hidden beneath layers of deliberate normalcy. Maya reached a new position near the warehouse loading dock, where she could observe both the interior search teams and the external perimeter that was being established to contain the situation. The scope of the operation was now clearly visible. with at least 20 personnel involved in what had escalated into a major security response. Maya realized that her investigation had uncovered something significant enough to justify resources that suggested this facility was crucial to operations that extended well beyond local criminal activity. The radio chatter she was monitoring revealed increasing frustration among the search teams, who were having difficulty locating a target that should have been easily contained within the warehouse complex. Maya understood that her unconventional movement patterns and tactical awareness were creating problems for opponents, who were expecting to hunt a civilian consultant rather than someone with advanced military training. But Maya also realized that her situation was ultimately unsustainable. Even with her tactical advantages and superior knowledge of the facility layout, she was outnumbered by trained professionals with superior equipment and unlimited time to systematically eliminate her hiding options. Her only realistic hope for survival lay in changing the nature of the engagement from defensive concealment to offensive action that would disrupt their coordination and create opportunities for escape. Maya's military training had included scenarios exactly like this one, situations where isolated personnel faced overwhelming odds and could only survive by exploiting enemy weaknesses through unconventional tactics that transformed defensive situations into offensive opportunities. The techniques were dangerous and required precise execution, but they offered possibilities for survival that pure evasion could not provide. As Maya prepared to transition from hunted to hunter, she felt the last vestiges of her civilian identity falling away. 8 years of careful construction were dissolving under the tactical necessity of embracing skills that had once made her legendary among a very small community of military specialists. The question was whether Maya Chen could disappear entirely, allowing someone much more dangerous to emerge without losing herself completely to an identity she'd spent years trying to escape. The warehouse complex was about to become a battlefield, and the woman preparing to engage 20 trained killers was no longer the quiet security consultant who'd arrived that afternoon to conduct a routine assessment. Maya was about to discover whether the skills that had made her reputation were still sharp enough to keep her alive, and whether she could use them without becoming the person she'd sworn never to be again. Maya's transformation began with her breathing. The shallow, rapid respirations of civilian panic gave way to the deep, controlled rhythm that had once allowed her to remain motionless for hours while waiting for targets to expose themselves at impossible distances. Her heart rate dropped from the elevated tempo of fear to the steady cadence that had made her legendary among military snipers, a biological shift so profound that it felt like awakening from 8 years of restless sleep. The first shot she fired in anger since leaving military service was a deliberate miss, designed to test her muscle memory and confirm that her marksmanship skills had survived years of suppression. The bullet struck a metal support beam 2 inches from where she'd aimed, close enough to confirm that her fundamental abilities were intact, but far enough to remind her that precision required practice she hadn't maintained. The sound echoed through the warehouse like thunder, announcing to everyone present that the nature of their engagement had fundamentally changed. Torres's voice crackled over the radio with new urgency, switching from Spanish to English as he coordinated with what sounded like a command element operating from outside the warehouse complex. Maya realized that her single shot had revealed capabilities that transformed their assessment of the threat she represented, triggering protocols that suggested they knew exactly who they were dealing with, despite her 8 years of civilian camouflage. Maya moved immediately after firing, abandoning her position before return fire could zero in on her muzzle flash. Her route through the warehouse took advantage of acoustic shadows and visual obstacles that would confuse enemy attempts to track her movement, techniques she'd developed during operations in urban environments where detection meant death. The rifle felt more natural in her hands with each passing minute, muscle memory asserting itself despite her conscious efforts to maintain psychological distance from the weapon. The tactical situation clarified as Maya monitored enemy communications and observed their response patterns. These weren't random criminals or even sophisticated smugglers. They were part of an intelligence operation with access to classified databases that had identified her true identity, possibly triggering the entire response specifically because Chen had been revealed as someone whose background posed a threat to their operational security. Her routine security assessment had been converted into a trap designed to eliminate a potential asset who might expose activities that extended far beyond the Bayview industrial complex. Maya's second shot was intentionally lethal, targeting a communications specialist who was coordinating search patterns from an elevated position near the warehouse office. The bullet traveled 300 meters through industrial air before finding its target with precision that announced to everyone monitoring radio communications that they were no longer hunting a civilian consultant. The immediate tactical impact was significant, disrupting coordination and forcing the remaining personnel to adjust their search patterns to account for a threat with professional-level marksmanship capabilities. But the psychological impact was even more profound. Maya felt the familiar satisfaction of a perfect shot, the mathematical beauty of ballistic physics converted into tactical advantage through skills that had taken years to develop and mere moments to resurrect. For 8 years, she'd convinced herself that those abilities were artifacts of a previous life that had no relevance to her civilian existence. The reality was that they'd been waiting beneath the surface, as much a part of her fundamental identity as her fingerprints or DNA. Torres's response confirmed Maya's assessment of the operational scope. Instead of escalating their local search efforts, he immediately initiated what sounded like extraction protocols, coordinating with helicopter transport and discussing timeline compression that suggested the entire operation was being terminated rather than reinforced. Maya realized that revealing her capabilities had triggered damage control procedures designed to contain exposure of whatever activities the warehouse complex had been supporting. Maya used the confusion created by Torres's extraction coordination to advance toward the warehouse office, moving through sections that the enemy teams had already cleared, but hadn't secured behind their advancing search line. Her route provided access to the communication equipment and documentation that would explain how her civilian identity had been compromised and reveal the scope of the intelligence operation she'd accidentally uncovered. The office area was more sophisticated than anything suggested by the warehouse's external appearance, containing satellite communication equipment, encrypted computer systems, and surveillance monitors that displayed feeds from cameras throughout the industrial district. Maya realized that the Bayview industrial complex wasn't just a distribution hub for illegal activities. It was an intelligence collection facility that had been monitoring activities throughout Seattle's industrial waterfront, possibly serving as a foreign intelligence station operating under commercial cover. Maya's examination of the computer systems revealed files that confirmed her worst suspicions about the compromise of her civilian identity. Facial recognition algorithms had identified Maya Chen as a potential match for classified personnel records, triggering investigations that had connected her current identity with her previous military service. Despite the sophisticated identity construction she'd maintained for 8 years, the technology hadn't existed when she'd disappeared from military service. But advances in biometric analysis and data correlation had made her careful camouflage obsolete. More disturbing were the personnel files containing information about other individuals who appeared to be former military or intelligence operatives living under assumed identities throughout the Pacific Northwest. Maya wasn't the only one whose civilian camouflage had been penetrated by analytical capabilities that could identify hidden operatives through pattern recognition and behavioral analysis. The warehouse complex was apparently serving as a coordination Center for Operations targeting multiple individuals whose backgrounds pose threats to foreign intelligence activities. The sound of approaching helicopter rotors indicated that Torres was implementing his extraction timeline, but Maya's position in the office complex provided opportunities to gather intelligence that would explain the full scope of the threat she'd uncovered. The communication equipment was still active, allowing her to monitor coordination between the warehouse operation and what sounded like a much larger intelligence network with assets throughout the United States. Maya's military training had included intelligence collection techniques that allowed her to rapidly assess and document enemy capabilities even under combat conditions. She began photographing documents and copying computer files that would provide evidence of foreign intelligence operations on American soil, information that would be invaluable to counterintelligence agencies if she survived to deliver it. But the process required time she didn't have, forcing her to prioritize the most critical information while preparing for the inevitable assault on her position. The assault came as Maya was copying the final database files, a coordinated attack by the remaining personnel who had recognized that allowing her to remain in the office complex would compromise their entire operational security. Maya's defensive position was strong, but not sustainable against determined assault by trained professionals with superior numbers and heavy weapons that could breach her concealment through overwhelming firepower. Maya's response drew on urban warfare techniques that transformed defensive positions into offensive opportunities through creative use of available resources. The office complex's electrical systems provided possibilities for improvised area denial, while the structural supports could be modified to create obstacles that would channel enemy movement into predetermined kill zones. Most importantly, the communication equipment could be used to coordinate with law enforcement agencies if she could maintain her position long enough for external reinforcement to arrive. But Maya's most significant tactical advantage was psychological rather than material. Her opponents were operating according to protocols designed for eliminating civilian targets or moderately trained security personnel, not for engaging someone whose capabilities approached those of elite special operations forces. Their tactical assumptions were fundamentally flawed, creating opportunities that Maya could exploit through unconventional responses that violated their operational expectations. Maya's defense of the office complex lasted 18 minutes, during which she eliminated 4 additional hostiles while maintaining communication security and completing her intelligence collection objectives. Her marksmanship was precise enough to achieve immediate incapacitation without creating noise signatures that would reveal her exact position, techniques that reflected years of training in environments where detection meant death for entire operational teams. The helicopter extraction proceeded on schedule despite Maya's interference, with Torres and the surviving personnel evacuating, while implementing destruction protocols that would eliminate evidence of their activities. Maya realized that her intelligence collection had been successful, but the cost would be the complete exposure of her civilian identity and inevitable questions about capabilities that couldn't be explained through legitimate security consulting. Experience. Maya's emergence from the warehouse complex occurred as Seattle Police Department SWAT teams were establishing a perimeter around the facility, responding to reports of automatic weapons fire in the industrial district. Her surrender was complicated by the fact that she was armed with military-grade equipment and had obviously been involved in a significant firefight, circumstances that would require detailed explanation to authorities who had no context for understanding the intelligence operation she'd uncovered. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Morrison was the first law enforcement official to interview Maya after her detention by SWAT personnel, and her questions immediately revealed that Maya's background had triggered alerts in law enforcement databases that connected her current identity with classified military records. Morrison's approach was professional but pointed, clearly indicating that Maya's involvement in the warehouse incident was being investigated as something more significant than simple self-defense. Maya's initial responses maintained the fiction that she was a civilian security consultant who'd been attacked while conducting a routine facility assessment. But Morrison's questions demonstrated access to information that made that explanation increasingly untenable. References to Maya's pattern of movement through the warehouse, the precision of her marksmanship, and the tactical sophistication of her defensive actions all suggested that law enforcement agencies were coordinating with military or intelligence sources that had identified her true background. The breakthrough came when Morrison mentioned specific details about Maya's military service record that should have remained classified permanently, including references to operations that had never been publicly acknowledged in commendations that existed only in sealed files. Maya realized that her detention was part of a coordinated intelligence operation designed to reintegrate her into official service rather than prosecute her for the warehouse incident. Maya's decision to reveal her true identity was prompted by Morrison's revelation that the intelligence she'd collected from the warehouse computers had already been analyzed by federal agencies, confirming the existence of a foreign intelligence network that had been operating undetected in the Pacific Northwest for several years. Maya's accidental discovery had exposed activities that posed a significant threat to national security, making her continued cooperation valuable enough to justify official protection rather than prosecution. The debriefing process extended over 3 days, during which Maya provided detailed information about her civilian identity construction, her employment history, and the specific circumstances that had led to her involvement in the warehouse incident. But more significantly, she underwent psychological evaluation designed to assess her suitability for return to operational status, testing that would determine whether 8 years of civilian existence had fundamentally altered her capabilities, or simply provided cover for skills that remained intact. Colonel Patricia Hawkins arrived from Joint Base Lewis McChord on the second day of Maya's debriefing, bringing with her classified files that contained Maya's complete military service record and documentation of the incident that had ended her career 8 years earlier. Hawkins's presence indicated that Maya's situation had escalated beyond local law enforcement jurisdiction into areas that required specialized military oversight. Maya's first conversation with Colonel Hawkins focused on the classified operation that had prompted her resignation from military service, circumstances that had never been fully investigated due to the political sensitivities involved in her final mission. Hawkins revealed that subsequent analysis had vindicated Maya's tactical decisions, confirming that her actions had prevented a diplomatic crisis that could have destabilized American relationships throughout Central Asia. The revelation that Maya's career-ending decision had been strategically correct was both vindicating and devastating, confirming that she'd spent 8 years hiding from consequences that had never been justified by the facts of her final mission. Hawkins explained that the classified nature of the operation had prevented official acknowledgement of Maya's performance, but that her tactical innovation and operational success had been studied extensively within special operations communities. Maya's psychological evaluation revealed that her civilian existence had provided emotional stability and perspective that enhanced rather than diminished her military capabilities, suggesting that her 8 years of hiding had actually prepared her for operational responsibilities that required broader understanding of civilian contexts and consequences. The evaluating psychologist recommended that Maya be considered for positions that would utilize her unique combination of tactical expertise and civilian experience. But Maya's response to the offer of reinstatement was complicated by her recognition that returning to military service would mean abandoning the peaceful existence she'd spent 8 years constructing, accepting responsibilities that would inevitably lead to situations where her skills would be used to end human lives. The warehouse incident had reminded her of both the satisfaction and the burden of capabilities that separated her from normal civilian existence. Colonel Hawkins's final offer reflected understanding of Maya's psychological complexity and the unique value of her background. Rather than conventional military service, Maya was offered a position with a joint task force that would utilize her skills for counterintelligence operations, targeting foreign networks operating on American soil, work that would protect civilian populations while providing opportunities to prevent the kind of intelligence penetration she'd uncovered in Seattle. Maya's acceptance of the position came with conditions that reflected her need to maintain connections to civilian life and her determination to use her skills in ways that were clearly defensive rather than offensive in nature. Her new assignment would allow her to keep her Seattle residence and maintain relationships with civilian colleagues, providing psychological anchoring that would prevent complete absorption into military culture. The transition to her new role required extensive briefing on foreign intelligence operations that had been identified throughout the United States, including several networks that had been operating undetected for years before Maya's accidental discovery had revealed analytical techniques that could expose hidden infrastructure. Maya realized that her warehouse encounter had been part of a much larger intelligence war that was being fought in American cities by operatives whose existence was unknown to the general population. Maya's first official assignment involved coordinating with other former military personnel who had been living under civilian identities, individuals whose backgrounds had been compromised by the same analytical techniques that had exposed her own carefully constructed camouflage. She discovered that her experience of hiding from military capabilities was far from unique, that many veterans had chosen civilian anonymity over continued service due to psychological damage or political complications that made conventional military careers impossible. The team Maya was assigned to lead included specialists whose backgrounds encompassed the full spectrum of military and intelligence capabilities, former operatives who had each chosen civilian existence for reasons that reflected the complexity of modern warfare and its impact on individual psychology. Working with people who understood the burden of exceptional capabilities provided Maya with the first genuine professional relationships she'd experienced since leaving military service. Maya's leadership style reflected her understanding that effective coordination of highly capable individuals required respect for their autonomy and recognition of the psychological costs associated with using skills that separated them from normal civilian existence. Her approach emphasized defensive operations and intelligence collection over direct action, providing team members with opportunities to contribute to national security without compromising their personal, psychological boundaries. The success of Maya's initial operations led to expansion of the program and recognition that former military personnel living under civilian identities represented a significant, untapped resource for counterintelligence work that required deep understanding of American society and culture. Maya's experience became a model for reintegrating highly capable veterans whose conventional military careers had been complicated by the psychological or political consequences of exceptional service. Maya's personal residence in Seattle became her operational base, allowing her to maintain the civilian relationships and community connections that provided psychological stability, while conducting work that utilized her military capabilities for clearly defensive purposes. The balance between her civilian identity and professional responsibilities reflected her recognition that her skills were most effective when tempered by understanding of the civilian context they were designed to protect. The warehouse complex that had triggered Maya's exposure was eventually converted into a joint task force facility, serving as a training center for operations targeting foreign intelligence networks, operating under commercial cover throughout the United States. Maya's role in the facility's development reflected her unique understanding of how civilian infrastructure could be exploited for intelligence purposes and her ability to design defensive measures that would protect legitimate business operations from foreign penetration. Maya's relationship with Detective Lieutenant Sarah Morrison evolved into professional cooperation that bridged the gap between law enforcement and military intelligence, providing local agencies with access to analytical capabilities that could identify foreign intelligence activities before they achieved operational significance. Morrison's understanding of civilian law enforcement procedures complemented Maya's military background, creating partnerships that enhanced both organizations' effectiveness. The foreign intelligence network that Maya had accidentally discovered was eventually dismantled through coordinated operations involving multiple agencies, but the analytical techniques that had been used to identify hidden American operatives continued to evolve, requiring ongoing development of new camouflage methods and operational security procedures. Maya's experience provided valuable insights into the psychological and technical challenges of maintaining cover identities in an era of advanced surveillance and data analysis. Maya's final conversation with Colonel Hawkins occurred 18 months after her initial exposure, during a ceremony recognizing her contributions to counterintelligence operations throughout the Pacific Northwest. Hawkins noted that Maya's unique combination of military expertise and civilian experience had proven invaluable for operations that required understanding of both tactical realities and civilian consequences, suggesting that her 8 years of hiding had actually enhanced rather than diminished her professional value. Maya's reflection on her transformation from hidden civilian to operational leader emphasized her recognition that exceptional capabilities carried responsibilities that couldn't be avoided through assumption of false identities or civilian camouflage. Her experience had demonstrated that skills developed through military training remained part of fundamental identity, regardless of conscious efforts to suppress or ignore them, but that their application could be directed toward purposes that aligned with personal values and psychological needs. The quiet security consultant who had conducted routine facility assessments no longer existed, replaced by someone whose responsibilities encompassed protection of civilian populations from threats they would never recognize or understand. Maya had learned that her legendary capabilities were not burdens to be hidden, but tools to be used wisely, instruments that could provide security for people who deserved protection from the complex dangers of an interconnected world. Maya's Seattle apartment still contained the neutral furnishings and mainstream decorations that had characterized her civilian identity, but the safety deposit box across town now held different items. Instead of hidden reminders of military service she was trying to forget, it contained operational equipment for missions that utilized her skills in service of clearly defined defensive purposes. The transformation reflected her acceptance that hiding from her capabilities had been less honest than finding ways to use them responsibly. The warehouse district where Maya had been forced to confront her true identity became a place she visited regularly for operational planning and training coordination. But the industrial corridors no longer reminded her of tactical vulnerabilities or escape routes. Instead, they represented opportunities to identify and counter threats before they could affect civilian populations, spaces where her exceptional capabilities could be used to create security rather than simply survive danger. Maya's story became a classified case study used to train other veterans whose military backgrounds had been compromised by advanced analytical techniques, providing them with models for productive reintegration that utilize their capabilities while respecting their psychological boundaries. Her experience demonstrated that the challenge wasn't hiding from exceptional abilities, but finding ways to use them that aligned with personal values and civilian responsibilities. The legend of Maya Chen, the security consultant, had lasted 8 years, but the reality of Maya, the counterintelligence operative, promised to continue indefinitely, providing her with purpose that encompassed both her military capabilities and her civilian understanding. She had stopped hiding from who she was and learned to embrace responsibilities that utilized her gifts while protecting the peaceful existence that others deserve to maintain. Maya's transformation was complete when she realized that her greatest contribution wasn't individual tactical excellence, but the development of systems that allowed other highly capable veterans to find productive roles that served civilian populations without requiring them to abandon the psychological anchoring that civilian existence provided. Her legacy would be measured not in targets eliminated, but in threats prevented and communities protected. The sniper who had fired her last shot in anger 8 years earlier had become someone whose greatest precision was applied to identifying and neutralizing dangers before they required lethal response. Maya had learned that the most effective use of exceptional capabilities was often prevention rather than reaction, protection rather than elimination, service rather than dominance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.